The International Monetary Fund early this week raised its forecast for Nigeria's economic growth in 2022 to 3.4% from 2.7% it earlier projected. Now, the global lender said the increase in oil prices has lifted growth prospects for the country. According to the IMF, April World Economic Outlook report released as part of activities of the ongoing IMF World Bank Spring meeting in Washington, it also stated that the said growth in sub-Saharan Africa is projected at 3.8% in 2022, while global growth is projected to slow from an estimated 6.1% in 2021 to 3.6% in 2022 and 2023. Now let's discuss this. We actually have joining us in the studio an economist, Dr. Tefa Abraham. Good morning and thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Now, from this, IMF projection, it seems like 2022 to 2023 is going to be a very challenging year for us, isn't it?
By last year, the IMF projected that our GDP growth, that's for Nigeria, will be lower this year compared to what we provided for in the 2022 medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper. Ideally, the 2022 MTEF and FSP provides benchmark assumptions that will be used to implement 2022 budget and run the fiscal year. That document pegs real GDP rates, benchmarks real GDP rate at 3.4% for 2022. But at the time, that's last year, the projection for IMF was lesser than that of Nigeria. So in other words, Nigeria hoped for a bigger growth of 3.4% in 2022, but IMF thought it would be less. And that was because IMF saw our double-digit inflation as a risk, saw our huge payment of subsidies as an avenue of gulping available resources to fund projects. So these were the sources of leakages and concerns that IMF and World Bank saw to reduce our growth forecast for last year. The conflict in terms of insecurity and climate change in crisis that affects agricultural output and also likely to trigger food prices were some of the factors that made IMF and World Bank to keep their own growth projection lower than that of Nigeria. But what we see in 2022 is that as soon as Russia-Ukraine crisis started, crude oil price started going up. We now have crude oil price way above $100 per barrel. In fact, the National Assembly and the executive arm of government had to even raise the budget benchmark for crude oil price from $62 per barrel to $73 per barrel for 2022. So it is anchored on this projection of increase in crude oil price attributed or triggered by the Russia-Ukraine crisis that IMF sees increase in crude oil price for Nigeria. And Nigeria being an economy that is highly dependent on crude oil sales, an increase in crude oil price simply means more revenue. More revenue means more expenditure program being implemented, and which will translate into growth. So that's why the IMF and World Bank raised their own projection to be 3.4%, the same as what Nigeria provided for in the 2022 MTEF and FSP. So it's just a projection of hope, but it's anchored on crude oil price, which is also a source of concern, because any drop in crude oil price will reverse that growth and expose us to another round of performing below expectation in terms of real GDP for 2022.
All right, so we also have joining us another economist, Dr. Muda Yusuf, joining us virtually from Accra, Ghana. Good morning and welcome to Daybreak.
Good morning.
To this IMF report, would you actually say Nigeria is making a backward movement, especially on achieving the Sustainable Development Goal on zero hunger by 2030?
Yes, there's a major risk to issue of welfare, issues of poverty, but arising from challenges that we are faced with in the macroeconomic environment. When you talk about poverty and you talk about well-being of the people, which are critical components of the SDG, inflation is a key factor. In fact, if there is anything you can describe as the enemy of the people or the enemy of the poor, or something you can describe as an accelerator of poverty, I think inflation is number one. And you can see what the inflationary situation has been. even though the figures, official data was putting inflation at around 15.9, thereabouts. In actual fact, the reality, if you talk to the average Nigerian, we are talking of inflation of close to 50, between 50%. If you look at the basket of goods that the average Nigerian consumes, and it's even worse with food inflation. Many prices, in the last 1 year, quite a number of prices have doubled. I'm talking basic things that people consume. So apart from talking about GDP, sometimes there is a strong connection between GDP and poverty, depending on what the prevailing conditions are with some other key variables. Look, as far as SDGs or welfare poverty is concerned, it's not looking bright at all.
Okay, now let me direct this to you, Mr. Tefa. Now, according to that same IMF report, it seems like developing nations, are going to be grossly affected, by the whole Russian-Ukraine war, and the global pandemic, that struck the world, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. Just like Muda Yusuf said, if you look at, there's a link from GDP to development and then to poverty, inequality. One thing I want to really emphasize is that the IMF revision, upward revision of our GDP growth is anchored on increase in crude oil price attributable to the Russian-Ukraine crisis. So if there's a crude oil price shock, GDP crashes, and you have many people going into unemployment and poverty is rising up again. So the concept there is that it is important, if we don't anchor our growth and development towards real deliberate programs that is targeted at raising people out of unemployment and poverty, using real projects and programs that the government can see, that we can see, touch, and have direct control over. Anchoring it on crude oil price that is exposed to the volatility of external markets can be really devastating if there's a negative shock. So the concept there is that once crude oil price has increased beyond the benchmark used for the budget, what is expected is for government to ramp up the savings around the excess. The savings, current market price about over $100 per barrel, minus what is used for the benchmark, which is $73, and save that excess so that we can draw down and channel this resource into other aspects of the economy. But the legislative framework for excess crude accounts has always been an issue that we're not too sure whether we have or we don't have. We saw during Jonathan's regime where that administration wanted to really save excess crude earnings, but we saw how the governors teamed up to say no. President Muhammadu Buhari is also experiencing the same thing right now. There's this revenue that is expected to come from IMF refund, Paris Club refund, and all that. The governors are also on the same page. 36 state governors refusing that no deductions should be made. So that habit of squandering anytime we have excess earnings or increase in revenue rather than saving is something that if we don't check, it will hurt our development. So again, the projection is anchored on GDP, which is just a projection. But in reality, we are dealing with real sector indicators like inflation, like weakened earnings in terms of wages, and then increase in goods and services in the open market. So deliberate planning, which should be anchored around the National Development Plan to ensure that we take our own destiny by our hands will really be important, rather than expecting that increase in GDP growth will automatically create employment and address poverty.
All right, now, Doctor, now quickly, the IMF also further warned that increasing levels of domestic government borrowings from banks in Nigeria and other emerging markets could threaten the country's, financial stability. How do you think this will affect the government finances and also the banks?
Yes, because of the challenges with budgeting and because of the pressure that this 4 trillion is going to put on the finances of government, we are likely to see increase, first in borrowing. Secondly, the burden of debt service is also going to increase. We're also likely to see more borrowing from the Central Bank of Nigeria to bridge some of these finance gaps. of these things have a major impact on the economy. And that is why part of the proposals of the World Bank is the need to accelerate reforms. First, reforms in the foreign exchange market so that you can see a much better inflow, a move closer to what you can call an equilibrium exchange. We can see better supply of forex and see much more investment. So, the foreign exchange market critical component in terms of looking at the way forward, which is part of what the World Bank has suggested. We cannot continue to manage an where you have this kind of very big gap between the official exchange rate and the parallel market exchange rate. It's highly distortionary. It causes a lot of dislocations in the economy. It also creates a currency problem in the foreign exchange market. It discourages investment. So that is one major reform that has to take place. The second reform that needs is around, of course, we already have an instrument of reform for the energy sector, which is the PIA, but we are not implementing it with the kind of commitments that can actually deliver the kind of results that we get. Part of the reason we are in this mess is reforms in the oil and gas sector for many years. And for many years, there was no concrete investment, either in gas or in the upstream or in the downstream. If anything, we were losing in that sector. A lot of resources in the oil and gas, they had left the country. Some of them had catered to the deep offshore because of the challenges of policy and the challenges of insecurity. So we see accelerate reforms, create more incentives.
Apologize, but time is not on our side, and would actually have to stop you here. Thank you so much for joining us on Daybreak today, Dr. Muda Yusuf.
Thank you.
All right, we also have in the studio Dr. Tefa Abraham. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.